Still come in for the the basket dinner, right? Yeah, that's good. So Jennifer and I had the opportunity on Tuesday night to go to Ray for the Gideon's Faith Fund rally, or whatever they called it. They had a speaker from Australia there. He had been a veterinary doctor, I guess, for many years, and was a Gideon during that time, and I think now he's retired from that and doing a lot of work with the Gideons, and had a presentation about their travel to Papua New Guinea and to New Zealand and also to the Philippines. And we got to meet some people in Ray working there in the schools, I guess. They're from the Philippines, so that was kind of cool. And we got to see, although we didn't get to visit with Byron's parents, they're Gideon members also. And I guess they're south of Yuma. But we mentioned Lynn earlier, and keep praying for Lynn with her infection in her foot. Pray for healing there, and pray for peace. I know it's tough for her being in the hospital. I don't want to mention all the people, but I'm looking at Paula also, and her dad's hand is causing trouble, slow to heal as well. Just a lot of prayer requests, a lot of burdens on our hearts. And I think that's part of the reason why it's nice to come to church and share burdens and share prayer requests and pray one for another. And I hope you're doing that even as you're home and in your own quiet time. And we'll mention the congregational meeting coming up also. And then I didn't remember, the old saying, a day late and a dollar short. And I'm usually at least in the first category, a day late. So I was thinking as I was sitting there after the prayer time of Glenn Doddridge and continuing prayer for him. He just is struggling, I guess, since December, trying to sleep. So hopefully he's not discouraged that we put his name online. Pray for Glenn. Pray for the family. And then I'm going to mention also thinking about just a time of prayer. We haven't had a prayer meeting as such since we've been here. And I keep thinking that we need a time of prayer, but it's so hard to find a time for prayer, for group prayer. I told Jennifer even this morning, I was thinking about it. If you pray at nighttime, some people can't come because of driving. Some people can't come because of work. If you schedule it during the daytime, some people can't come because of work and schedules, and there's no perfect time. And then you think, well, let's just schedule a prayer time every day of the week at 10 o'clock and 6 o'clock. And that's not going to work. And then I thought, well, we can have a Zoom prayer time. And then I thought, that's just not the same. You don't have that fellowship and community. But anyway, I want to throw it out there. Think about that and what would be a possible time that we could just gather together and pray. And I know part of the difficulty of any meeting like that, any additional schedule, is it just starts going longer and longer and longer. And you schedule it for 45 minutes, and then pretty soon it's 55, and then pretty soon it's 75, and then it's an hour and a half. And so somehow to find a reasonable amount of time to just pray for the needs in the church, as a congregation, as a group. So pray that we can set a time to pray. Does that work? I don't know. We've been talking about Nehemiah and the history of his ministry in Jerusalem. So go back to Nehemiah. Before Job. And we want to continue in this book. This was somewhat a discouraging week for me as I was going through the book of Nehemiah, because of all the conflict that Nehemiah was dealing with, all the enemies that he was dealing with. And then later on I got to thinking, oh, well, this is encouraging, because along with being aware of the enemies that Nehemiah faced, you see that Nehemiah responded to those in such a way that the work continued, and the nation was strengthened, and the people were edified and built up. So as we go through some of these conflicts and some of these enemies that Nehemiah faced, we want to recognize that there are always enemies that we're going to face as well. But hopefully we will not focus so much on the enemies and the conflicts as we will, what is a character that was demonstrated by Nehemiah when he faced these enemies? What was it that allowed him to carry through? So we're probably all old enough, even the kids in the back there are old enough to realize that life is never without conflict. There's always going to be conflict. There's always going to be problems. There's always going to be discouragements. And they tell us that the conflict is never the key to success, but rather it's how we respond to that conflict that determines our success or failure. And so as we go through that, as we go through the book here and look at some of these things, think about what's a character, and then think about your own life. What character has got you through the conflicts? Sometimes we end up with the hope, or maybe the expectation that if we're serving the Lord correctly, we're not going to have any problems. If I can just be holy enough, all my problems will disappear. And hopefully we're past that stage where we're not expecting that anymore. And to realize that conflict sometimes comes because we're holy. Sometimes conflict comes because we're unholy. Sometimes conflict comes because we're doing good. Sometimes conflict comes because we're doing bad. And so that was discouraging to me as well. You keep hoping that, okay, well, if conflict is coming, I know it's because I'm doing good. Well, that's not always true. I know I've had conflict in the past, and it was because I've done bad. So conflict itself doesn't tell us we're doing good or bad. But how we respond to that conflict can be good or bad. And it can build us or it can destroy us. And so I want us to think about that. I wrote down the titles, some of the songs that we sang. I thought I'd just mention it again also. Challenge us to think about the songs as we go through some of these conflicts. There is no rock like our God. To be able to face the conflicts that come into our life because we say, God is my rock. I shall not be moved. And then, by your grace, I have hope. I like that, right? It's by your grace that I can face these conflicts, and I have hope that I will come out at the other end stronger and better able to serve the Lord. And then we had a song, If I've Got Jesus, I've Got It All, as we're going through the time of conflict. And then that made me think of the Sunday school. If you were in Sunday school this morning in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, it says, rejoice evermore. And somebody brought out the idea that we don't rejoice because we're facing conflict, but we can rejoice in the midst of the conflict. And in everything, give thanks. For this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. And I look at this history of Nehemiah and all of the conflicts that he faced. And I don't want to discourage you too much, but I found 12 enemies that Nehemiah faced in 13 chapters. And granted, some of them are duplicate. They're just a different approach that the enemy tried. And then the other discouraging thing was that we're tempted to think that the enemy is out there. And Nehemiah faced what I called external enemies. But he also faced internal enemies. Internal conflicts. And then, to add to the discouragement, the external enemies totaled only 5, and the internal enemies totaled 7. And that's even more discouraging. And it reminded me of Paul. If you have your bookmark, keep it there in Nehemiah so you don't lose a page. But Paul, in Acts chapter 20, when he was talking to the Ephesian elders, and this was the last time he said he was going to see them. And he said in verse 28, take heed to yourself and to all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. For I know this, that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Also, from among yourselves, men will rise up, speaking perverse things, to draw away the disciples after themselves. So you've got the enemy coming in from the outside, and you got the potential for the enemy rising up even from the inside. You got the external enemies, you got the internal enemies, and Nehemiah faced them both. And again, I want to just challenge us to think about, okay, what was it in Nehemiah's character that allowed him to go through this? So if you remember the beginning of Nehemiah, the story of Nehemiah, he was a cupbearer for the king, and he had heard about the distress that was back in Jerusalem. And he came before the king to do his duties as a cupbearer, and the king noticed that he was downcast, and so the king asked him about it. He said, what's wrong? You've never not been like this before. And so Nehemiah tells a story about the distress of his nation and his city back in Jerusalem. And then the king says, well, what do you want to do? What are you going to do about it? And so Nehemiah gives his request. Let me go back and let me have permission to rebuild the walls and rebuild the gates of the city. And so then in chapter 2, he gets the permission and he makes a trip. In verse 9, it says, then I went to the governors in the region beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. And in verse 10, you have the first external enemy. When Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, heard of it, They were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. And I got to thinking, it's possible that Nehemiah did not even know about these enemies at this time. But the enemy was somehow simply disturbed and grieved that somebody was out to seek the welfare of the people of God, the nation of Israel. And some of the commentaries made the idea that they were concerned about their own position, their own economics maybe, their own status, that if Jerusalem were to be rebuilt and repopulated, that their status would lower and Jerusalem's status would rise. It could be just a simple case of economics and position. It could be a case of being an enemy of the gospel. Paul talks about the enemies of the gospel in Philippians chapter 3. That there are people who just simply do not want word about God, about Jesus Christ, to be popular, to be preached, to be proclaimed. And so in verse 10 it says they were grieved, and in the King James Version I think it says, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. An enemy, just because one was for God and one was against God. It made me think of our own situation in our country today and in our world today. That there are people in our world today who are committed to opposition simply because of a religious view. And I think to myself, how does that work? We as believers in Jesus Christ, what do we do when there's somebody who says, well, I don't believe in God. Why should I believe in God? I don't believe in Jesus Christ. I don't believe that you guys should have a church in your community. And how do we respond to that? And you think there's a lot of people in the world today who literally respond with violence. Dina's not here. I think Dina is mentioned in Sunday school, the situation in Nigeria. Some of you maybe keep up on that more than I do. But Christians being killed in Nigeria just because they're Christians. Indonesia, the same thing over and over again. The Middle East, the same thing over and over again. Violence just because of a religious belief. And how does a Christian community respond when somebody is grieved because we want to do church and we want to worship the Lord? And like I said, maybe Nehemiah didn't even know about it at this time, but there was somebody that was on the lookout, somebody that was worried that Nehemiah had come to town. The second occurrence of opposition occurs at the end of the chapter, verses 19 and 20. So Nehemiah had made the trip in secret around the community. He had viewed the walls torn down. He had viewed the gates torn down. There were places where his donkey could not even pass because of the rubble. And he came to the rulers and he told them about what he had viewed and what he was dreaming of. And the ruler said in verse 18, the end of the verse, they said, "Let us rise up and build." Then they set their hands to do this work. In verse 19, once again, enemy number two, the external enemy. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Gershom the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king? So now you've got actual open opposition. Three things, it's right. They despised us. Yeah, it might not be so bad. Maybe they call you names, you know. You think you're going to build this wall, you haven't got a chance. You're a joke. They despised us, they laughed at us, but the third thing I think is kind of critical, kind of serious. They're being accused of rebelling against the king. Like maybe Christians are accused of rebelling against the government because we say our God is the God in heaven. And our God is Jesus Christ. And we're going to rise up and we're going to build. We're going to proclaim the word of the Lord. And you can laugh at us, you can despise us, but we are moving forward. And you can say we're revolting, but we're going to move forward. And so in verse 20, Nehemiah answered them and said, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build, but you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. We are going to move forward. And I hope that somehow, in spite of all the opposition that you might face personally, somehow you come to the point where you say, I don't care. I'm going to move forward. I want the Lord's work in Cope to move forward. And then I thought even, you know, in our family, because there's always opposition in the family, right? There's always conflict in the family. And hopefully at the end of that conflict, at some point in that conflict, the family gets together and say, all right, let's stop. We're a family, and we're going to move forward as a family. And we're going to do something to make this family better. We're going to build this family, not only for the sake of the family, but for the sake of the Lord. We're going to rise up and we're going to build. The third enemy, we briefly mentioned it last week in chapter 3. Chapter 3, remember, has a whole list of people that did work, families and individuals. And then it has a whole list of what these people and groups did, where they built, and this section of the wall they built, and this section of the gate they built, and all of them working together. And that idea of what are your talents, and what are your gifts, and what are your responsibilities, and are you doing the work that you're supposed to be doing? And are we working together so that we're building one community? We're working on the wall far away from each other, but we're doing it to build a wall. But you had in verse 5 one group that apparently just decided, no, we don't think this is a good idea. So next to them it says, the Tekoites made repairs, but their nobles did not put their shoulders to the work of the Lord. And here you have the first internal enemy. The third enemy mentioned, the third opposition, but now it's internal. You got somebody that just says, well, you guys go ahead, do your own thing. I don't believe in this. I'm not going to do anything to help. And somehow it doesn't really say how Nehemiah responded to that. It just sort of said, let them do their thing. I'm moving forward. You don't want to help, just go off and sit by the side. tell stories about us, make fun of us. We're going to do the work. We're moving forward. Actually, I'm forgetting some of the character, right? I tried to divide it. When Nehemiah faced the first opposition, maybe he didn't even know about it. I had the character of faithful to the task. Nehemiah was just moving forward. I'm going to do the task. And then at the end of chapter 2, at the second opposition there, when they laughed him to scorn and they accused him of revolting against the king, trusting in God's faithfulness. Our God is faithful. This is what God is leading us to do. We're counting on God's faithfulness. We're going to move forward. And then the first internal opposition, which I just mentioned in verse 5, where they just said, we're not going to do the work. We're not going to help. The character of Nehemiah, once again, being faithful to the task. You don't want to help? Nah, okay. But we're going to move forward. We're going to build the wall. We're going to build the gates. We're going to do the work of the Lord. You want to sit on the side? Okay. And it made me think of Romans chapter 14, where Paul is talking about some people ate meat offered to idols. Some people did not eat meat offered to idols. We were talking about standards in Sunday school, right? Standards of righteousness or standards of evil. And in this particular case, Paul says, there's some of you that eat meat offered to idols, no big deal. Some of you don't eat meat offered to idols, no big deal. It doesn't matter, Paul says. But he continued and he said, each of us are going to stand before the Lord in judgment. And we're going to give an account to the Lord for how we've lived our life. And I sort of thought of that with Nehemiah chapter 3 and verse 5, where they said, we're not going to help. The nobles, no less, the leaders saying, you guys go ahead, we're not going to help. We don't believe in this. And I thought of Nehemiah with Romans chapter 14. I'm going to do my thing. I don't have to answer for them. They're going to give an account to the Lord. 2 external conflicts, 1 internal conflict. And Nehemiah remains faithful to the work. Nehemiah chapter 4. We'll try to get one more in here. Another external enemy, back to our friends Sanballat and Tobiah, or we shouldn't call them friends maybe. Back to our individuals, Sanballat and Tobiah. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 7. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry, and all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. So now it's more than just verbal. It's more than just making accusations of rebellion. Now they are so angry that they're prepared to do violence. And again, you sort of sit on this, think of the whole situation as if you're on the top of the mountain looking down and you're saying to yourself, what's wrong with these people? Why are they concerned that the walls are going up? It's like they're not even part of the community. They live in a different place. What do they care? But they're so angry that they're literally threatening violence to the people in Jerusalem. And the character, let me not forget that this time. The character there. Nehemiah is concerned for the safety of the nation, the safety of the people. Making plans. What do we have to do to make sure that our people are safe? And it's kind of interesting that Nehemiah gathered up swords and spears, but not to attack, but simply to defend. And I think this is kind of interesting. Verse 9 says, "Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God, and because of them, we set a watch against them day and night." And we don't have time to go into it all. If you do, take time during the week to read this. It says in one place that with one hand they built a wall, and with one hand they held a sword. And I think some of the people were saying, yeah, you might not be able to do a whole lot if you're just using one hand to build, and you've got the heavy rocks you're trying to move and whatever's involved there. But it was like half and half. Half of the people stood guard, half of the people worked. And Nehemiah himself said that his people were with him, guarding also, and carrying the trumpet. And whenever anyone heard the sound of the trumpet, they were all to gather together and protect one another. And I like that idea of what Nehemiah said in verse 9, we made our prayer to our God, but then also we set a watch. What's the old phrase that people talk about? Pray as if everything depends upon God, and work as if everything depends upon you. And, you know, I can always find fault with something like that, but it's a good thought, no? Pray as if everything depends upon God, and then say, Lord, what do you want me to do? What can I do to make this situation better? What can I do to protect the people in this situation? What can I do to protect my family? What do I have to do, Lord? I need your wisdom. There's opposition I'm facing. I need your wisdom. What do you want me to do? Somehow not to get discouraged over the opposition, but to recognize that it's there and then trust in God and say, I want to serve God. I want to move forward, regardless of what happens. And we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't even know what's going to happen later today. But somehow to say, Lord, use me to be a blessing to others. Amen.